Integral pieces to game development, characterization, and dialogue are but two implementations in which game developers visualize meaning. But what might these be without the means of providing a euphoria of information through aesthetic? Color is a means of providing said stimulation. Visual harmony and coherence, vulnerability and chaos, illustrating a rich world with continuity between frames. Through strategic presence, game makers cast a veil, embedding a purpose for all within eye's view. What lies at the surface is often overlooked, though ironically, we often take a game's visual artistic color palette for granted, by comparison to pure visual fidelity and reaching photorealistic puddles. Color is a capstone of tools available to game developers and artists simply waiting to be molded. The presence of contrast, saturation, hue balancing, color grading, among others, exemplifies its sheer scale. Game makers illustrate with purpose, to define an identity and push the player toward overcoming obstacles and growing through adaptation and personal development. Identification of functionality and mechanics through repeated color visualization directs player awareness towards this mission of becoming a more alert, refined player. Enter the first commercially renowned video game, Pong, a game aesthetically simple yet efficient. While its color differs depending on television signal format, generally, white is utilized for objects essential to one's interaction with the game, such as the algorithmic reliant ball and player-controlled paddles, with scoreboard and divider. The space that occupies the rest of the screen is black, acting as a contrasting color for the sake of placing focus on areas important to gameplay. With simply a palette consisting of two colors, white and black, an abundance of information can be conveyed. Despite being developed in a generation free of monochromatic constraints, Playdead's captivating atmospheric side-scroller, Inside, displays a similar minimalist representation of color, lacking conformity for the sake of surreal dramatization and imagery. Black and white are utilized in an alternate sense, with darker black shades being used for primary sources of platforming and puzzle solving, and white consisting of spaces not within the player's primary field of view, or used for the purposes of eliminating spaces covered in shadows. While Pong's palette was inherently a constraint held by television signal format reliant hardware, the birth of specifically alterable color displays allowed for full and vibrant color palettes to be utilized and provide further means of progression and functionality. However, with constraints comes those who break them, and, for an understandable sake, to progress the medium by experimenting. Inside especially relates this idea, but before narrowing back into the specifics of how color can differ from its universal meaning or general use cases, let's dive into how games effectively develop color-based progression and clarify areas of danger. Still within a retro-esque scope, the 1983 classic Super Mario Bros. Outfits our protagonist, Mario, in a red that generally contrasts the much brighter or darker tones associated with the background. Platforms denoted typically in orange and brown, or colors related to item blocks and specific items have a similar consistency. As progression continues, these colors largely remain the same, with only background, enemy variety, and some platforming segments changing in a major way as the game progresses towards the battle between the titular character and Bowser. These changes are often denoted by name and color. For instance, when the player character first stumbles upon a green pipe in level 1-1, there is nothing significant about it. It is only when a piranha plant, colored in green, protrudes from the top of the pipe, signifying the object is housing potential danger, more on that later. The player then internally associates pipes with danger before learning to traverse through them, making them more alert. In more recent entries, purple has served a similar function, yet to represent deception rather than hostility, and piranha plants are coated in red rather than green, likely to go with a more recognizable identity as hostile. Red is visually striking to the eye, and as discussed with the modern piranha plant, stick in the player's mind to denote areas of hostility and danger. While certain enemies or objects are typically denoted in this way, what if a game consisted of shades of red as part of its primary color palette? In the game Doom, specifically Doom 64, or for the rest of the series, a red-oriented color palette is used for much of the game's aesthetic, having harsher browns as a contributor towards suggesting the overarching danger present in the game, evident based on its mass of grotesque enemies and gore-reliant systems. Other than Doom Guy, the protagonist, enemies and environments are typically denoted in red in color and identify the landscape as enemy territory. Superhot's faceless humanoid enemies can surely overwhelm the player as they approach en masse, identifiable by their bright hue. Backgrounds are highly saturated to further emphasize this, and interactable objects, colored in black, can be used as weapons in the slow-based focused combat system, betraying functionality in a clarable sense. Signals for evolution of gameplay and player knowledge, as well as faction and identity, generally follow a set of universal patterns, as previously mentioned, with brighter colors denoting early progression, light, safety, and harsher colors often signifying late progression closer to a game's climax or conclusion, darkness, and hostility. Most genres typically abide by this pattern, and often create a consistency where colors are easily alterable for the sake of accessibility to all types of players. Thereby, typically color can be associated with areas of aggression and hostility in video games, with those of lesser importance placed under monochromatic or colors of altering saturation that contrast the visual hierarchy of the player character and their primary interactable environment. Games are designed with a player's existing legend or color association in mind, though do not always follow conventions, typically to keep a player on their toes and alert, for the purpose of thematic meaning and messaging. Through repetition of these color schemes, the player learns and adapts,